Picture this. You are standing in the middle of a hospital corridor at 7 in the morning, still in your scrubs from the night before, and your phone is ringing. Not a patient call, not the floor supervisor, your husband. And something in the way his name sits on the screen, just his name, nothing unusual, makes your stomach drop before you even answer. He does not say hello. He says, "I need you to come home. We need to talk." You have heard those words before, in movies, in other people's stories. You never thought they would arrive in your life on a Tuesday, between a 12-hour overnight shift and a cup of vending machine coffee you had not even finished yet. Think about what it costs a person to become a nurse, not the tuition, not the licensing exams, though those are real enough. Think about the other cost. The years of learning to hold someone else's pain without dropping it. The missed holidays, the birthdays you worked through, the dinner plates you left in the refrigerator with little sticky notes, because you knew you would not be home in time. Think about doing all of that while also being a wife, while also trying, quietly, desperately, every single month for 4 years to become a mother. Tracking cycles on a phone app while checking vitals, crying in a supply closet between rounds because another test came back negative. Walking back out onto the floor 60 seconds later because someone needed you, and that need was real and immediate, and yours was private. 4 years of that. 4 years of building a life with a man she thought she understood. And then a Tuesday morning phone call that came before the coffee had even gone cold. Her name was Marlena Oakes. She was 37 years old. She had worked the cardiac care unit at St. Augustine Medical Center for 9 years. The kind of nurse who remembered her patients' grandchildren's names and kept extra pairs of grip socks in her locker for the ones who forgot to bring their own. She was methodical and warm, and quietly competent, the kind of person who made everything look easier than it was. Her husband was Colin Graves. They had been together for 6 years, married for 4. He was a commercial real estate broker, good-looking in the way of someone who had always known it, charming at dinner parties, the kind of man who shook hands like he was closing a deal, even when he was just saying hello. Marlena had loved him with the particular devotion of someone who had chosen carefully, who had not rushed, who had believed that love was a contract you signed with your whole self. She had believed a great many things. When she got home that Tuesday morning, her bag was already by the door. Not her work bag, her actual bag. The one from the top shelf of the closet, the structured leather one she had bought herself the year they got married, the one she only used for travel. It was packed, zipped, sitting in the entryway like a decision that had already been made. Colin was in the kitchen. There was a woman at the kitchen table, drinking coffee from the mug Marlena had brought back from a nursing conference in Denver 3 years ago. She was young. Not young in a cruel way, just young. The kind of young that is simply a fact, like weather. Her name, Marlena would learn later, was Portia Sloan. Colin did not look at her when she walked in. He looked at the counter. He said, "I'm sorry, I should have said something sooner." He said some other things after that. Things about growing in different directions and needing something he couldn't explain and how he hoped she would understand in time. Marlena stood in her own kitchen and listened to her husband explain the shape of her ending, and she did not cry. She had cried too much in supply closets for too many years. There was nothing left that Tuesday morning except a very specific, very quiet kind of stillness. She picked up her bag. She walked out. She sat in her car in the driveway for 11 minutes. She knew it was 11 minutes because she watched the clock, not because she was timing herself, but because her brain had defaulted to clinical mode, the part of her trained to observe and document when everything else had stopped working. She drove. She did not know where she was going. She drove until she found herself on a road she did not recognize, in a part of the city that was older and quieter than her neighborhood, and she pulled over because her hands were starting to shake and she had enough professional judgment left to know that shaking hands should not be on a steering wheel. She sat there, just sat there, in a car she had paid for herself, in scrubs she had worn for 12 consecutive hours, with a bag packed by someone else on a street where no one knew her name. That was when the knock came. It was soft. 2 knuckles against her window, careful, not startling. She turned, and there was an old man on the sidewalk beside her car, maybe 70, wearing a gray wool coat despite the April warmth, his hands clasped politely in front of him like he was waiting for the right moment to speak. His face was lined but unhurried, the kind of face that has seen enough of life to stop being surprised by it. She rolled down the window. He said, "I'm sorry to bother you. I only stopped because I have been walking this block for 30 years, and I know when someone has parked somewhere they didn't plan to be." She did not know what to say to that. She said, "I'm fine." He tilted his head slightly, not unkindly. "You don't look fine. And I'm not saying that to be rude. I'm saying it because you're sitting in a car alone at 8 in the morning in your work clothes, and you look like someone just took the floor out from under you." She stared at him. And then, without planning to, without any preamble at all, she told him everything. Not the version she would have told a colleague. All of it. The 4 years. The tests. The closet. The bag in the entryway. Portia Sloan drinking coffee from the Denver mug. 11 minutes in the driveway. He listened. He did not check his phone. He did not offer solutions or silver linings. He simply stood on the sidewalk in his gray wool coat and listened to her the way very few people ever had, like her words mattered more than whatever came next. When she finished, he said quietly, "My name is George Whitmore. I have a guest room and a very good housekeeper who makes exceptional biscuits on Wednesdays. And you are not going anywhere alone today." She looked at him for a long moment. Under any other circumstances, in any version of her life, where the floor was still where she had left it, she would have politely declined and driven away. But the floor was gone, and he had the steadiest eyes she had ever seen on a person who was not her father. She said yes. The house was a brownstone on Alderman Street, narrow from the outside and unexpectedly deep once you were in it. The kind of house that had been lived in by someone who actually read the books on the shelves and sat in the chairs by the window. There were photographs everywhere. A younger George in what looked like a university courtyard. A woman with copper hair laughing at something off camera. Children and grandchildren and a border collie who appeared in approximately 40% of the photos. Marlena sat on the sofa while George made tea he had not asked if she wanted but that she needed without knowing it. And she looked at those photographs and felt something loosen slightly in her chest. "The collie," she said when he came back. "What was his name?" "Baxter," George said. "He passed 4 years ago. My wife went 2 years before him. The house has been very quiet." He said it simply, the way people say things that have been true long enough to stop being unbearable. Marlena nodded. She understood quiet. She stayed for 3 days. Not because George insisted. He was far too polite for that, but because she genuinely did not know where else to go. Her parents lived in Phoenix. She had not called them yet because calling them meant saying it out loud in a way that made it final, and she was not ready for final. Her closest friend was a travel nurse currently somewhere in New Mexico. The apartment she had looked at once, when she and Colin went through a rough patch 3 years ago, and she had looked, just looked, was long since rented. The guest room had a window seat. The housekeeper, a practical Haitian-American woman named Mrs. Beaumont, did in fact make exceptional biscuits on Wednesdays. George would appear in the kitchen each morning already dressed, already composed, as though disorder was something that happened in other people's houses, and he would ask Marlena how she slept, and actually wait for the answer. On the second morning, she met his son. He came in through the back door, which apparently was how he always arrived, letting himself in with his own key and calling out, "Dad, your porch light is out again," before he had even taken his jacket off. He stopped when he saw Marlena at the kitchen table. He was maybe 40, a little over 6 feet, with his father's unhurried quality and his mother's copper coloring, from what Marlena could piece together from the photographs. He was not what she had expected George's son to look like, though she wasn't sure what she had expected. "This is Marlena," George said from behind the newspaper he was reading. "She's staying in the guest room for a few days. Marlena, this is my son Theo. He was a cardiologist." She had not told George she was a cardiac nurse. She had told him she was a nurse, and the details of the unit had not come up. When Theo introduced himself and mentioned St. Augustine in passing, her mouth did something that might have been a smile for the first time in 48 hours. "I work at St. Augustine," she said. "Cardiac Care Unit, 9th floor. His expression shifted, not dramatically. Just a small adjustment, the kind that happens when something unexpected turns out to make a particular kind of sense. I have privileges there, he said. I'm usually at Hargrove Memorial, but I rotate. I know, she said, and then caught herself. I mean, I've seen your name on patient charts. George put down the newspaper just enough to look at both of them over the top of it, and then put it back up again. Theo came by every evening that week, and then the week after, because Marlena had not yet found an apartment, and George had stopped asking when she planned to look for one. They talked in the kitchen after dinner, while George watched the news in the other room with the volume slightly too loud. They talk the way people talk when they have the same professional language, and can use it as a bridge into the personal, about difficult cases, about the particular fatigue of cardiology, about what it does to a person to spend years in proximity to the fragility of the human heart. One evening he asked her how long she had been at St. Augustine. 9 years, she said. You like it there. I love it, she said, and the truth of it surprised her, the way certain things you have always known feel new when you say them out loud. I love the work. I love the patients. I was good at everything in my life except the thing I wanted most. She had not meant to say that last part. He did not look away from her when she said it. What did you want most? He asked. She looked at her hands. To be a mother. He was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of discomfort, the quiet of someone making room for what was just said. Did anything ever come of that? He asked carefully. Specialists told me my cycles were irregular and that conception was unlikely. She paused. I was told to manage my expectations. He looked at her with an attention that was different from sympathy, sharper and more specific. Who told you that, my Obe? And a reproductive endocrinologist we saw the second year. Did anyone ever check for adenomyosis? She went still. No, she said slowly. No one ever mentioned that. He pulled his chair slightly closer, not physically, just attentionally. It's commonly missed, he said. The symptoms overlap with a half-dozen other things and imaging isn't always conclusive. But irregular cycles, painful periods that were dismissed, failed conception. It's worth looking at, Marlena. With the right diagnosis and the right treatment, the picture can change significantly. She sat with that for a long time. After he went home, she made an appointment. Not with her old OB, with a new specialist Theo referred her to, a woman named Dr. Prisha Okonkwo at the Whitmore Center for Reproductive Health, named, she would later discover, for George's late wife Eleanor Whitmore, who had funded it in its early years. The coincidences in her life were beginning to accumulate in a way that felt less like coincidence and more like something she did not yet have language for. Dr. Okonkwo spent 2 hours with her and ordered imaging that no one had ordered before. The results came back 10 days later. Adenomyosis, significant, long-standing, entirely treatable. This has been present for years, Dr. Okonkwo said. Possibly the entire time you were trying. The good news is that we have excellent options. Hormonal therapy first, followed by a minimally invasive procedure, and then we give your body time to recalibrate. I cannot promise you a pregnancy, Marlena, but I can tell you that your previous diagnosis of unlikely was almost certainly based on incomplete information. Marlena walked out of that office and stood on the sidewalk outside and breathed for a very long time, not crying, just breathing, taking in air and letting it back out, the way you do when something has been sitting on your chest for 4 years and someone has just gently lifted it. She called George. He answered on the second ring. Good news or complicated news? He said, because he had learned by then how she organized information. Complicated news that might become good news, she said. Come home then, he said. Mrs. Beaumont has leftover biscuits. She did not tell Theo about the diagnosis, not immediately. He had done something significant for her, offered her a thread to pull, but the thread was hers and she wanted to follow it herself. There was something important in that, in doing the next thing under her own power, in not arriving somewhere because someone had carried her there. She found an apartment in June. A 1-bedroom on Calder Street, 3rd floor, good light, close enough to the hospital to walk on the mornings she needed to think. George helped her move in, which meant he supervised while his driver and Mrs. Beaumont's nephew actually moved things, and he stood in the middle of the empty living room afterward with his hands in his coat pockets and said, "Your father would have done the same thing I did, stopped the car." She looked at him. You mentioned him, George said simply. Your father, the way you said he died. 8 years ago, heart attack. He was only 62. The way you said it, I knew he had been the person who made you feel like the world was a safe place to exist in. And when I saw you pulled over on my street, that was what I thought. Someone has lost their person, and they are all alone. She did not try to hold back what came after that. She cried in the middle of her empty apartment, and George put a hand on her shoulder, the way her father used to, firm and steady and entirely without condition. She started treatment with Dr. Okonkwo in July. The procedure went well. The recovery was 8 weeks of enforced rest that Marlena spent reading, visiting George in the evenings, and slowly, without planning to, spending more time with Theo, who dropped by Calder Street under various pretexts, a book his father had left for her, takeout from the Thai place she had mentioned once. A very long conversation about a patient case they both happened to know that lasted until nearly midnight. She was not looking for it. She had been very clear with herself on that point. She was recovering from a marriage and a grief and 4 years of invisible loss, and she was not in the market for anything that required her whole heart, because her whole heart was still being repaired. But Theo was not performing. That was the thing. He was not trying to be what she needed. He was simply himself, in a very unhurried and undemonstrative way, and somehow that was exactly what she needed, which she had not asked for, and could not have predicted, and was slightly inconvenient as a result. One evening in September he said, I owe you an apology. She looked up from the book she had been reading. For what? For taking 3 months to say this. He set down his coffee. I think about you in a way that I'm fairly certain is unprofessional, given that you're my father's friend and my patient's referral, and I work at the same hospital where you work. He paused. I thought you should know. She looked at him for a moment. That's a very clinical way to say what I think you're saying. I'm a cardiologist, he said. I'm more comfortable with the clinical framing. She set down her book. I think about you too, she said, in a way that is probably also inadvisable. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Outside, the city did what the city does, all traffic and other people's lives continuing as usual. We don't have to do anything about it, he said. No, she agreed. We don't. They both knew they were going to. Marlena went back to work in October. She had taken a leave of absence during treatment and recovery, and returning to the floor felt like returning to herself, the specific self that existed when she was useful and present, and moving with purpose through a room full of people who needed things she knew how to give. Her patients did not know she had been gone or why. They knew she brought extra grip socks and remembered their grandchildren's names. She was 3 weeks back on the floor when Colin called. She did not answer. He texted. She read the text, which said only, I heard you were dealing with some health stuff. I hope you're okay. She put the phone face down on her kitchen counter and left it there for 6 hours. He called again the following week, and this time she picked up because she had decided that letting him occupy real estate in her thoughts was more expensive than the actual conversation. I heard you had a procedure, he said. I did. Are you okay? I'm fine, Marlena. His voice had that particular quality she used to find reassuring, the gentled down version of his sales voice. I know things ended badly. I know I handled it wrong. You packed my bag, she said, while I was finishing a 12-hour overnight shift. A pause. I know, he said. You had a woman drinking coffee from my mug. I know, and you told me you hoped I'd understand in time. He was quiet. I do understand, Marlena said. That's the thing. I understand exactly what you did and why, and I'm not angry anymore, which is not the same as forgiving you. I just don't have room for you in the life I'm building. She paused. I hope Portia makes you genuinely happy, Colin. I mean that. But this is the last time I'm answering when you call. She hung up. She stood in her kitchen for a moment afterward, expecting to feel something large. Instead, she felt something small and clean, like a room after you have opened all the windows. She texted Theo. Done with something I should have been done with a long time ago. He texted back 4 minutes later. Dinner tomorrow. My pick. Don't argue. She did not argue. By December, Marlena had moved through the final phase of her treatment, and Dr. Okonkwo had used a word she had not used before, hopeful. Not guaranteed, not certain, hopeful. It was the most beautiful word Marlena had heard in years, she told Theo. They were in George's kitchen, the three of them, the week before Christmas, and Mrs. Beaumont had made a pot roast that was making the whole brownstone smell like warmth, and Marlena looked across the table at this man and his father, and felt something she did not immediately have a name for, only that it was the opposite of standing on a sidewalk with shaking hands. "Doctor Okonkwo thinks there's a real chance," she said. "Not a promise." George put down his fork. He looked at her the way he had looked at her on that April morning when she rolled down the car window, steady and unhurried. "Your father," he said quietly, "was the most patient man I ever knew. He would wait for the right moment on anything. He always said, the thing worth having is the thing worth waiting for." Marlena looked at him. "You knew my father?" George was still for a moment. She watched something shift in his face, a gentle, careful movement, like a door opening that had been waiting a long time. "Garrett Oakes," he said softly. "Class of 1979 Northeastern. We lived in the same building for 2 years. He was in finance, I was in architecture. We stayed close for 20 years after. I lost track of him when I moved the firm abroad. I looked for him for a long time after I came back." Marlena's throat had closed entirely. "He passed 8 years ago," she managed. "I know," George said. "I found out 2 years after the fact, and by then I couldn't find his family. I didn't know he had a daughter. He talked about wanting children for years, and then we lost touch, and I never—" He stopped. His eyes had filled. "I never knew." She pushed back from the table, and she went to him, and she held on to him, this man who had stopped his car on Alderman Street because something in her face looked familiar, who had given her a guest room and Wednesday biscuits and his son's phone number for a specialist, who had been her father's closest friend for 20 years, without either of them knowing they were connected by the woman sitting at his kitchen table. He held her back the way her father used to hold her, tight and without condition. "You've been home since April," he said into her hair. "You just didn't know it." She stayed at the brownstone that night and the night after, and by January she had developed a habit of coming by on Sunday mornings that nobody had formalized, but that had the solid, unremarkable quality of a tradition. George would have the newspaper. Mrs. Beaumont would have coffee. Theo would come in through the back door and say something about the porch light and sit across from Marlena like he had always been going to sit there. In February, Dr. Okonkwo called with results from a follow-up that Marlena had treated with the careful, low effect of someone who had learned not to let herself hope too loudly. "Marlena," she said, and something in the pause before the next word made Marlena sit down very slowly on the edge of her Calder Street bed. "You're pregnant." She sat there for a long time after the call ended. She did not move. She pressed one hand flat against her sternum, the clinical gesture of a cardiac nurse, checking that the thing beating in there was still doing its job, and she felt it, still there. Stronger, maybe, than she had expected. She called George first because she had learned that was who she called first now. He answered on the second ring. "Good news," she said, "the kind that becomes more news." She heard him exhale, slow and full, the breath of a man for whom this information carried the weight of everything he had been trying to tell her without saying directly since April. "Come home," he said. She went. Theo was there when she arrived, still in his coat from the hospital, and she told him standing in the hallway because she could not wait until they got to the kitchen. And he took both of her hands in his and looked at her in a way she had never seen on a person's face outside of the moments when she told patients they were going home. And he said simply, "I would like to be there for this, all of it, if you'll let me." "I know," she said. "I know you would." It was not a romance novel moment. It did not have soundtrack music. It was just two people standing in a hallway in February with their coats still on, deciding something true. They did not hear from Colin for several months. When his name appeared in her phone in late spring, she had already stopped answering, which she had promised herself she would do, and had kept the promise. She heard through a mutual acquaintance the kind of low-key information transfer that happens in mid-sized city professional circles, that Portia Sloan had ended things with Colin approximately 3 months into what had apparently been a longer, messier arrangement than Marlena had understood. That Colin had sold their shared condo and moved to a different part of the city. That he had reached out to several of their mutual friends, asking if anyone had heard how Marlena was doing. She was doing, it turned out, exceptionally well. The invitation arrived in June. Colin's name on an envelope, his handwriting on the front, her Calder Street address. She opened it with the particular calm of someone who had already grieved what needed grieving and moved through the other side into somewhere quieter. A card, informal, his handwriting. I got engaged. I wanted you to hear it from me. I know this is a lot to ask, but it would mean something if you came. I'd like you to see that things worked out. That we're both okay. She read it twice. Then she set it on the counter beside her coffee. Theo found it that evening when he came over for dinner, which he did on Tuesdays and Fridays and increasingly on other nights when no particular reason was necessary. He picked it up. Read it. Set it down. He wants you there to witness that he's fine, he said in the tone of a man who understands exactly what is being asked and exactly why. I know, Marlena said. Are you going to go? She looked at him. At the man who had come in through the back door and learned her coffee order and held her hand in a hallway in February and came to every prenatal appointment she would let him come to, which was all of them. At the man who had never once looked at her like she was something that needed to be managed. Yes, she said. He looked at her carefully. Why? Because I want to, she said. And because I've spent enough of my life not doing things I wanted, because I was afraid of what they'd look like. He thought about that for a moment. Then he said, okay, but I'm coming. She shook her head slightly, not in disagreement, but in the particular pleasure of being known. I know you are. George, when told, was quiet for a moment, in the way that meant he was deciding how much to say. Then he said, I'm too old to attend that man's theater. But you are not going in anything less than what you've earned. He looked at her. The rest of us will handle the details. She did not ask what details. She had learned by then to trust George's particular brand of quiet management. On the morning of the wedding, she was helping button the back of the dress she had not bought herself. George had sent it with Mrs. Beaumont 3 days prior, a deep marine blue that was specific enough to be intentional. When she heard a sound she could not immediately identify. A low thrum, growing, directional. She went to the window of the brownstone's 3rd floor. In the lot behind George's house, where in 30 years of walking Alderman Street, she had never seen anything except parked cars and a storage unit, a helicopter was touching down. Private, dark blue, smaller than she had imagined. 2 of George's people were already out there. She put her hand against the window glass and watched it settle. George appeared in the doorway of the room. He was dressed better than she had ever seen him, which was considerable, given that he always dressed well. He had a small box in his hand. Your father, he said, crossing the room, gave me these at my wedding. He told me his daughter would need them someday. I told him I didn't have a daughter to pass them to, and he said, George stopped for a moment. His jaw was set against something large. He said, trust me, George. You'll know the right girl when you meet her. He opened the box. Inside, 2 pearl earrings on a simple gold setting. Her mother's, she recognized them from photographs, from the one on the mantel in her parents' Phoenix living room, where her mother was 26, and laughing at something her father had just said. She could not speak for a full minute. George closed her fingers around the box. He was right, he said simply. I knew immediately. The helicopter cleared the city in 11 minutes. Marlena sat with her hands folded in her lap, 7 months along and entirely visible in the marine dress, and Theo sat beside her with the solid, unhurried patience that was his particular signature. And she watched the morning light shift over the city below and did not think about Colin Graves at all. She thought about her father, who had given pearl earrings to a friend for a daughter not yet born. She thought about a sidewalk on Alderman Street in April. She thought about the word hopeful in Dr. Okonkwo's voice. She thought about all the threads that had been quietly arranging themselves into this exact morning, while she was busy thinking her life was ending. The venue was a restored estate property 40 minutes north of the city, the kind of place that required a drive down a long gravel road through manicured fields. The helicopter set down in a clearing, and they walked, the 2 of them, across the grass toward the gathered guests. She saw Colin before he saw her. He was standing near the entrance, dark suit, glass in hand, the comfortable proprietary ease of a man hosting his own occasion. Beside him was a woman Marlena did not know, blonde and polished, not Portia Sloane, the new arrangement. He turned when the murmur went through the nearest cluster of guests. She watched his face as he found her, the specific journey from recognition to recalibration. The slow arrival of 7 months in a marine dress and a man beside her, and a life she had clearly been building without him, all communicated before she said a single word. He crossed the grass. The social math of it was significant. He left his own side to come to her. Marlena. His voice had something in it she had not heard before. Not exactly the sales voice, something raw. You look. He stopped. She said. His eyes moved to her stomach, then to Theo, then back to her, and in the particular quality of that look was the full cost of an accounting he had not done until right now. I didn't know, he said. No, she agreed. You were, no, not then. She said it cleanly, without cruelty, because the truth needed no embellishment. I found out afterward that the diagnosis was wrong, that there was something treatable, something that had been missed for years. She paused. Good doctor and a lot of time, and here we are. He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him working something out, the same arithmetic men do when they are understanding the fulfillment of choice. They cannot unchoose. Are you happy? He said. It was, she thought, the first honest question he had asked her in probably 3 years. Yes, she said simply. Are you? He looked back toward where the woman in the white dress was watching from a careful distance. Something moved in his face, genuine and complex. The face of a man who had wanted an answer to be yes and was not entirely sure it was. I'm working on it, he said. Then I hope you get there, Marlena said. And she meant it. There was no theater in it, no performance for the audience of guests who were absolutely watching. She meant it the way you mean things when you have already finished grieving and come through the other side into something so much wider. She took Theo's hand. She turned back toward the field. There was a moment then when she might have kept walking, but she stopped. Because from the edge of the crowd, she saw her. A woman she did not know, perhaps Colin's new fiancé's mother, standing slightly apart and watching the whole exchange with the face of someone who understood exactly what they had just witnessed. She caught Marlena's eye and gave one slow, very slight nod, the nod of one woman to another. Recognition without words. Marlena nodded back. Then Theo said her name quietly, a question inside it, and she looked up at him. Ready, she said. The helicopter was gone. They had a car waiting, and the drive back to the city took them past the kinds of neighborhoods Marlena drove through on the way to work, ordinary and continuous. People walking dogs and carrying groceries, and living the Tuesday morning fabric of regular life. She watched it all and felt herself fully inside it. That evening, all 3 of them were in George's kitchen, Marlena at the table, Theo across from her, George in his chair with the television murmuring in the other room. Mrs. Beaumont had left a plate of biscuits on the counter, because she always did now on evenings, when Marlena came, which was most evenings. George looked at her over his newspaper, the precise inch of look he used when he was deciding something. And, he said. He's working on it, she said. George lowered the paper a full inch further. And you? She looked around the kitchen, at the photographs on the walls. His late wife in copper light, the border collie named Baxter, and now a new one she had noticed going up quietly last month. Herself and George on a Sunday morning in October, her laughing at something she could not even remember, his hand on her shoulder, both of them at the kitchen table where she was sitting now. I've already arrived, she said. He raised the paper back up, but she saw, before it covered his face, the thing he had been trying not to show, which was the particular joy of an old man who had found the daughter he did not know to look for, and who got to be there when she understood that she was home. 3 months later, in a hospital room at St. Augustine Medical Center, 9th floor, on a unit where the nurses knew her name and kept extra grip socks in their lockers, Marlena Oakes delivered a daughter, 7 pounds 4 ounces, strong lungs, eyes that could not yet see far, but that tracked toward light with the determined attention of someone already paying close attention to the world. They named her Eleanor, for a woman in copper-haired photographs who had funded a clinic that found a diagnosis that changed everything, for a name that felt like it belonged to someone who had always been coming. George was in the waiting room. He had been there since before they arrived. When Theo came out to get him, he was in his gray wool coat despite July. standing at the window with his hands clasped in front of him exactly as he had stood on the sidewalk on Alderman Street more than a year before. He walked into that room and looked at Marlena and the child she was holding, and he did not try to manage whatever came onto his face. He simply let it be there, all of it. The 40 years of a friendship, and the daughter he had promised earrings to, and the granddaughter who had just arrived without anyone planning for her, and a Sunday morning kitchen, and a story that had started on a sidewalk when he saw a woman who looked like someone he had been missing without knowing it. He put his hand over Marlena's on the blanket. "Well," he said softly, "there you are." And Eleanor, 3 hours old, turned her face toward his voice, toward the light, toward the first of what would be many Sunday mornings, many kitchens, many biscuits, many hands holding hers as she figured out the world. She had kept walking, her mother. Even when the floor was gone and her hands were shaking and she had parked on a street she did not know, she had kept walking, and look, just look, where the walking had brought them both.